Hey folks, my name's Kevin, and it's time for some pretty exciting knife nerdery, because today we've got the full small details review of the Oz Machine Co Roosevelt. Yes, that's right, the ultra-hyped industry darling knife nerd favorite, the Rosie. And that intro right there probably tells you something right off the bat. So this is a knife that is one of those high-end CNC made with a lot of hand finishing work, semi-custom, semi-production knives up in the high-end space. It's made by a single maker in one shop, a guy named Daniel Osborne. And Daniel Osborne started making, I believe, like a pry bar tool, and then he made a fixed blade, and he first introduced his first folder knife. The Rosie is his first folder knife. He basically introduced it at Blade Show 2019, but not as an exhibitor. He just kind of brought his prototypes around and showed them off to people. And so he started making these in more serious production in, I think, like around end of December or maybe November of 2019. So he's been doing this for about 2 years now. And as a result, he's still relatively new to this space, in that kind of high-end space. And I gotta say, he obviously is exceptionally talented. The stories I've heard is that he said that he watched a ton of YouTube and Instagram content trying to understand what people said they liked and didn't like in a knife, and tried to incorporate that feedback into his initial design. And as a result, from the very get-go, these knives have been extremely well received by people that really, really know about knives. So yeah, these are hyped. These are beloved at the moment, but also these are extremely expensive. We'll get to that later. That's kind of the elephant in the room. The table price isn't ridiculous, but the aftermarket price is kind of ridiculous. And so as a result, you could easily be one of the large majority of the knife population that lives in the kind of regular budget space, and you might have never even heard of something like this. But if you're like deep into the knife hobby, especially if you're someone that's already purchasing knives in the $500+ range, looking at things with fancy materials, try and get that to show up correctly. Look at that. And just this kind of high-end precision machine stuff. You either already own this, have owned it, or like the most of us have been desperately trying to get one. I have been lucky enough to check this one out because Kevin over at Lefty EDC was kind enough to send this my way. So this particular one is Rosie number... Get that to light up correctly. I don't know if you're going to be able to focus on that or not. This is Rosie number 158, made in April of 2021. Yeah, okay, so this knife really, yes, it's super hyped up. But I personally think this is one of those rare knives that actually really does live up to the hype. It's doing almost everything truly exceptionally, and a few things it's doing in a legitimately literal unique way. It's doing some stuff up here with how it does its detent system that is unlike anyone else on the market as far as I know. And so it's gonna be really fun to break this down and talk about just what makes this stand out and why are people so excited about it. Oh, and by the way, if you only watch one part of this video, watch the part about how this pivot system works with the detents. It is fascinating. We're going to get real nerdy. And so I'll put chapters down below. But seriously, if you are going to watch if you're one of those people that wants to jump around and only watch 5 minutes, watch that portion. I promise you, this is interesting. So right off the bat, let's start talking about this blade. This blade is such a good slicer. Holy crap. There's a lot of different things that it's doing that go into that. Part of it is that it's using thin blade stock, and part of it is that it keeps getting thinner as it goes. It's a full flat grind, and it's very thin behind the edge. This blade stock is 0.125, 125 thousandths, but you never actually encounter that because you can see this full flat grind comes all the way up and actually is like extended up to the point where this is thinner right on the other side of that than it is behind it. In fact, it's thinner enough that the highest you ever encounter is 0.115, but it thins out this entire way. It's important to, we're going to spend a little bit of time on this and get kind of nerdy because the grind here is not just very aggressive, but it's kind of deceptive in a way that makes it even thinner than you might think. Now, initially, these blades were ground, I believe, by him directly, but this one is late enough in production that he now outsources this blade grinding to Larkin Precision, and they did a spectacular job on this. And let's bring out a couple other things. I'm going to use these other knives as comparisons throughout this video, in part because a lot of people have compared these. This is the Quiet Carry Drift, and it initially didn't have a thumb stud. It had a D-shaped hole, just like this. And since they both have a choil, they both have thin slicey blades, a pretty darn similar geometry. People have compared these a lot. People have also compared these two knives. This is the TRM Neutron. And so people have compared these a lot, and people compared these a lot. It seems natural to compare all three. All three of them do have this same kind of like one continuous swooping arc along the back type thing. And we'll talk about that too when we get into the handle geometry and all that kind of fun. But now let's talk about this grind. So on a knife like this up here is a flat. And that means that this is the full thickness of the blade. This is a very, very thin blade. It's 0.09 according to them. I measured it at 0.086, is even thinner. But up as long as this flat exists, this knife is going to be that full thickness, as long as this flat is here. So this is going to be, that is thin, but it's that full thickness all the way to there. Now on a drop point blade, as that tip drops, that's doing two things. It's bringing that tip further down for utility purposes, like the lower down the tip is, the more and more close it is to something like a sheep's foot or warney, the easier it is to get that tip down onto a surface. But the other thing it's doing is dropping that tip beneath the grind line, the top of the grind line. And that means that the further you drop below the grind line, the thinner it's going to get. And on a knife like this, that grind line is running right here. We're going to use this sheet of paper with these lines that are going to represent, like if this was a belt satin, to represent what the plane that the grind line is on. And on this knife, you can see it would line up right with this line right there. And so if we put it on top, what we get is we can see that this tip drops below the top of that plane. On the bottom hand, so the further it goes below that, the thinner it's going to get. On the bottom hand, this is the thinnest it's going to get. This is the bottom of the grind. And so as we come up from this line at the bottom, the higher we go, the thicker we are coming up this grind. And so the thicker is going to be thicker behind the edge up here than it is down here. And that's why you'll see some knives start to have a wider bevel at the top of the actual sharpened bevel. And on this knife, you can see that the tip down here is about 1/3 the way. So it's not going to be a super aggressive thinning out when looking at this. It also means that we come up 2/3 the way. And so it's going to get thicker and thicker as we come up here. So from those two perspectives, this knife isn't going to be an excessively quick drop off or get excessively thin behind the edge, excessively thin up behind the point. This is such a thin blade stock that it does get very, very thin, but you can see that the taper there isn't super aggressive. If we compare that to this TRM, here is the top of that plane for the grind, and if we put that along the edge here, we can see that on this knife, because this is a shorter knife altogether, this tip here plunges down enough that we're about halfway through this grind. Similarly, it's pretty darn close to the bottom. And so this one's going to get thinner at the tip compared to the full thickness than that one will. And it's going to stay thinner behind the edge than that one. And if we look at this from above, sure enough, you can see this really, really thins out. There's a longer distance that's thinning out over, and it comes to a thinner point to begin with. And so this is thinner, more delicate tip. Now, I spent a long time not talking about the Rosie yet. And the thing is, the reason why I talked about all of that is because when you look at a blade like this, it's easy to get kind of confused at what this shape is. And it's easy to think of this as the top of the grind and say that this is relatively flat and the grind is obviously slightly dropping down below that. And it's also easy to then think that, oh, it must be coming up really, really high and thus must be kind of thicker out here. But spoiler, look how exceptionally thin that is. And the reason is because it's not like this oriented on the plane, the way it might initially look. It's actually ground a lot more like this. And what that means is that this part up here that kind of looks like it would be a flat, it looks like it's maintaining the full thickness, it's not. That is dropping below the grind line. And so it's actually thinning out this entire way. And if you look at how far down this comes, it's coming really, if quite far, about halfway of the much, much taller grind. And so it's actually quite thin down here. And so even though there's this big swoop, it's actually swooping down first before swooping back up. And if you measure behind the edge, it's, it's tough because these are all very close, but it's actually slightly thinner right here than right here. And it doesn't actually get that thick up here. It stays super, super aggressive the entire way. We're talking about 13 thousandths behind the edge almost this entire way. It gets up to about 14, 15 thousandths behind that edge. We also have this swedge up here that's dropping that even further down, which means that this just comes to this incredibly, incredibly thin tip. Super, super precise, which means this is definitely a slicing knife. This is not a heavy duty knife. You dang well better not pry with that tip, but my God, will it pierce. And then since this thing is so thin, so tall, and comes to such a thin, aggressive grind here, this is an exceptional slicer. Holy crap. Now, because this isn't my knife, I didn't put this through a crazy amount of anything. I put it through regular cardboard and double wall cardboard, and that really hard cardboard I've shown in a couple of past videos. And oh my God, this is so freaking slicey. So from that perspective, I love this. Super duper love this. From my personal taste and the type of cutting I typically do, it's not my favorite blade shape. I personally would rather this be something that is more in the direction of a sheep's foot or Wharncliffe. I like a lower down tip. Now, it's interesting here because this tip is actually pretty darn low. If you look at how this actually lines up, this tip comes so far down, if you really orient this the way that this grind is actually happening, that the tip is below the pivot. And on a lot of knives, that would make this a Wharncliffe or something because the blade would just come straight out and then you'd have more blade up here. But on this knife, we have a really low tip, but a lot of belly. And what that means is a couple of things. It means that it's actually not that hard to get this tip down because the tip is low enough that you actually don't have to tilt your wrist very far down to get it onto a surface. But this is such a fat belly here, such a big swoop, that it's hard to get the very, very tip down. You have to really kind of angle this much further to get that because you're up against that belly. And that's both good or bad. If you really like working with just the tip, that's what someone said, then it might not be your favorite blade shape, and it's not mine. But this kind of belly here does work fantastically if you're doing like a rolling draw cut. It means that you can contact so much of this blade with a surface. You can cut with this portion or that portion or that portion or that portion or that portion. And if this were a true Wharncliffe where it was a straight edge, you can really only cut on against a flat surface or with the tip. So this is a more versatile edge. Again, personally, I would like it to be something slightly different. And so one of the things that I went into reviewing this knife with is the sense that I expect it to be an extremely mean knife. And from a blade shape perspective, it's not. I want something different. But from a blade geometry and cutting and thinness and everything perspective, holy crap, it is so freaking what I want. The knife itself, I should have talked about the blade. This one is in Z-infinit, which is a trade name for LC200N. And that is one of those nitrogen-based, essentially completely rust-proof knives. It's not quite as truly rust-proof as Vanax, but it is the kind of steel that is effectively impossible to rust, which is why I think it's a pretty cool choice here. When the very first few versions of these were done in AEBL, and he has done a couple in MagnaCut. And for my personal needs, MagnaCut is, I guess, a better direction than LC200N is for me. because MagnaCut gives you slightly better edge retention and at the cost of slightly worse toughness. But this is such a thin, slicey knife that I think anything you do to increase edge retention, well, I mean, obviously he chose something that's very, very stain resistant, so he wants to maintain that. So MagnaCut is more in the direction I'd want. What I would especially love this in something like Van X, but I personally, with a knife that's this thin and so obviously slicey, I would want this in something like S90V, M398, something that's like really, really focused on edge retention above all else, slicing and everything like that, but still has high corrosion resistance. This is not a knife that you need toughness in, so something like this, or even something like MagnaCut that are high in toughness, I don't think it's quite the right fit. But it's not a bad steel, and it's certainly not a bad steel for just an EDC knife. I think it's pretty well rounded, and it's going to hold up well. This in particular one is in a stonewash finish, and I think it's a really, really nice stonewash finish. He has also offered acid stonewash finishes, and he's done hand satins on versions that are full customs. You can request that. He charges $50 more or something like that. And these days he's also doing a Zerk Blast finish as an option. I personally would choose this one. I love this finish. I think it is a really, really well done, really nice, shiny, beautiful version of a stonewash. And so if this were my knife to get to completely customize, this is the finish I would pick. They also didn't originally always have this swedge, and by customer request, some of them have had rounded crowned spines, but I don't think he does that much anymore, and this version with the swedge is probably my favorite. Although one thing I will say about that swedge is that if you're holding this in a pinch grip, this does get so thin that if you are trying to push on this, you're pushing on something that's relatively thin. And I don't love that, but I don't think this is the knife I would reach for to do like something I need to push really, really hard and cut with the tip anyway. And so I don't mind that from that perspective. Let me think of other things I'd want to talk about this blade. Right, okay. So this plunge grind is exceptional. This is so well done. And it's worth noting that it wasn't always. So Daniel is one of those makers that takes customer feedback really, really strongly. There's been a lot of little tweaks to this knife, and it's improved over the years because he actually listens to folks. And one of the things you'll see if you look at the early versions of this knife is that the plunge grind, the grind that takes it from the full thickness down to the thinness behind the edge, was nowhere near as aggressive, and it used to come all the way out to here, which would mean that you have very little sharpening room. As is, this is done perfectly. This is such a steep, aggressive grind, and it comes down to right there. So you have this entire distance to sharpen, and it would look like an entirely different knife if you actually sharpened away all the way up to that point. And so this is just a perfectly done plunge grind. The one thing I will say about this plunge grind, and this is probably my only real stylistic complaint about this knife, is, and it's not, this is super nitpicky, it curves out at the top, and I don't understand why. This is a perfectly straight line. This is a straight line, sure, it's at an angle. Yeah, there's curves elsewhere, but I don't get why that curves forward there. I mean, maybe if I hold it this way, it'll shine in the light better. It just seems weird to me that this swoops forward at the very end, and it's such like a stupid minor thing, but in my mind, I think it would be harder to make that curved. I think it would be probably easier just from a manufacturing process to make it straight. I think it would look better straight. So I don't get why that was done. But that is a ridiculous nitpick. And if that's my only real complaint stylistically, we'll talk about more what I think about this anyway. But yeah, that's the only thing I would say about that plunge grind. Moving back, let's talk about this handle and this finger choil, because this is exceptionally well done. This handle is one of those tall, thin knives. I think this entire thing is 0.41 inches, something like that. So it's very slim and it's tall. And as a result, it's not going to fill your hand the way a much thicker knife is. But I think that this is exceptionally comfortable in hand. If you hate thin, tall knives, you're not going to like it. I'm pretty darn used to that. That's certainly what we have here. This is a tall, thin knife. It's even thinner. This is a tall, thin knife. It's kind of what I'm used to in this day and age. And so as a result, I will take that thinness trade-off for carryability over kind of hand fill out in any day. And the way that it's done, the handle, is just really, really good. This chamfer that runs along the entire thing gives it this nice kind of wrap around contoured-esque feeling at the edges, and then the seams along those chamfers are so well done. This particular one has gone through a couple of versions in terms of the finishing, and so I'm not sure how much of this nice smooth rounding I can accredit to that. This originally came as a dark stonewash or something like that. I forget exactly what he calls it, but it had since been re-blasted by the owner, the original owner, with a Zerblast finish. And so if you compare this to the straight Zerblast that he does, it's darker in color still, but it does have that kind of slight texturing to it that you get from a Zerk type blast compared to a sandblast or anything like that. I don't know, because Kevin left EDC, he didn't know whether or not that Zerk blast was done by Daniel himself, but I have heard of him re-blasting knives for customers, so it's entirely possible that that's the case. But in case this was done aftermarket, all I know is that it was done exceptionally well. From a shape perspective, though, it feels so good in hand. It has this really prominent choil here, and this is the kind of thing where, yeah, theoretically you could hold it like this. And in my hands, I can kind of get my last finger there. I wear medium glove hands, I think kind of on the smaller side of medium glove hands. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. And this is where it lands if I try to do that. In theory, you could do that if you wanted to get your hand entirely out of the way, but still have it in this type of grip. But why? Why would anyone ever do that? I've never reached for the knife in that way, and I can't think of any reason why I would try to do that. It makes so much more sense to hold it like this, where your middle finger sits there, this one wraps around there. And in that case, these chamfers here make your finger wrap around this so pleasantly. And this just feels so nice in my hand. The one thing I'll say though, is if you try and turn this around for that kind of like pull, draw, cut, that I very rarely ever do that. Sometimes I'll do that if I'm cutting rope. Sometimes I'll do that if I'm trying to, it almost never comes up in my life, but I can say you kind of have to choke back if you're doing that, because if you try and hold it around this, that's going to stick into your hand in a way that's just very uncomfortable. But again, I don't know why you would do that with this particular knife. The big thing I want to talk about is the way that this choil is done in terms of where it's positioned on the handle and what impact that has on comfort, because it's a big difference. A lot of knives will put a choil up in front of the handle, and you can see on this drift that what that means is that this back half, you are on the full blade stock and wrapping around some portion of the handle. And so if you're pulling back here, this feels quite comfortable. But the further you go up, you no longer have the handle beneath your finger, and you're instead pushing directly on the blade stock. And since this is such a thin blade stock to begin with, and because we are in front of the plunge grind, it means that on this particular knife, this choil up here, we're pushing on a very thin portion of metal. And under normal circumstances, you're pushing kind of up and back slightly in this kind of direction, because you're curling your finger down and pulling in. And so this is actually still a very comfortable choil, but the more you kind of cant the knife this way, and the more that you have your thumb up here, the more that the directionality of your force is pushed up or even forward. And any amount of force that's pushing into this thin piece right here, that sucks. That does not feel good at all. And so the way that you fix that, per se, like a better way to design a choil, if comfort is your number one thing, is to move the choil further back down into the handle so that you can have the handle bracing the choil on either side. Now that comes with an obvious trade-off. This knife, I can hold it like this, get all of my fingers on, and I don't need to use the choil. I can optionally scoot up, and then I have some blade sticking out. By scooting the entire choil backward, you don't really have that option. Like we talked about, you can hold it like this, but realistically, you're going to want to use this. And so to have the full thickness of the handle here, bracing your finger to push against means that you kind of have to have it pulled back as something that you always use. You'll see some knives will extend, like a Spyderco does this a lot. They'll extend the choil forward and they'll just start the grind so much further. Like they'll have an entire portion sticking out back here that is just the full thickness of the blade stock. And I think, boy, there's a word for that. I think it's called like a ricasso or something like that. But anyway, that means that you at least have the full thickness of the blade as what you're pushing against, but it's still not going to be as comfortable as this, where you have the entire handle down there. So anyway, this feels fantastic. The one thing I will say about this is that I don't like this jimping. This is actually my only real complaint about this knife, is that I don't like this jimping. I bring it up now because it talks about where my thumb hits when there's different grips. If I'm holding it in basically kind of the way I would in like a hammer grip, but with my thumb up on it, my thumb comes all the way past it and doesn't even touch it. And so this is quite comfortable. If I cant the knife forward in my hand, now my thumb is landing on it. And if I really push this forward, if I'm trying to like really aim this forward to get this tip into something for piercing purposes in the side of a box or something, I don't know, then I can get back here. And back here, I like this. Up here, I don't really. But at the end of the day, this is just my least favorite kind of jimping. It is the kind that's really wide, really deep, and not very sharp. And so as a result, this is the kind of thing where if you push down hard on it, you're basically pushing on a bunch of bumps, and they're able to push deep into your thumb. And it's not very crisp on this. This is pretty rounded off. And as a result, if your thumb is at all slippery, like my hand is just a little bit slippery, I don't find that this really grips my finger very well. It just kind of runs past, and I kind of hate this the way this is. What I would prefer this to be is shallower, closer together, and sharp. And that's what we have over here. This is kind of my favorite kind of jimping. It's not the absolute favorite, but this is very shallow, pretty darn close together, and crisp edges. And as a result, even with my thumb in the same state it was over there, when I press down on this, it locks me in. I can't slide at all. And conversely, I can push as hard as I want, and it doesn't feel like anything's pushing in. It doesn't come down deep enough to be able to push in. And so I find this jimping super comfortable and really effective. I find this jimping not at all comfortable and not very effective. The caveat is I'm talking about my bare hands. And I've been told that this style of jimping is just better if you're using gloves. And so if you anticipate using gloves and as the primary use case for having this knife, maybe that's for you. Alternatively, if you've got like just fundamentally different hands than me, like if you have really big hands and you have really thick calluses and pushing into this doesn't matter, this might not be a problem for you at all. But I would, in my personal opinion, I would take away that jimping altogether. I would do, just have none whatsoever, because I find knives that have no jimping up here so much more comfortable. And the thing about jimping is that it gives you traction, right? Well, and on this atom, I mean, this is the neutron, but the atom is the same shape. Yeah, you kind of have a little bit of a concern about sliding. You're never going to do anything with this that you would slide, but this is the kind of knife that has such a pronounced choil. There is no chance this is moving around in my hand. This can't possibly slide. So this jimping is doing basically nothing for me. Moving further back, let's talk about this clip, because this clip is exceptionally well done. This particular one is in black zircotite. So this is a Damascus style blend of alloys that contains both titanium and zirconium, and it has been heat treated to pull out these wild colors. And the thing that I think is really, really cool about this particular one is that it has these greens and pinks. I'm getting the colors. It has these greens and pinks. And you just don't see that often. It's much more common to get oranges, reds, purples, blues, but this like lighter teal and like actual true green, that's hard. You just don't see it. I'm not entirely sure how he did it. And it could be that this is a quality of zircotite, and I just don't know enough about how that tends to do or what alloys they're putting in it. But they, like, if I can get yellow right there, that makes this particular one stand out to me as exceptional. It looks different and interesting compared to what I normally see. And in particular, it matches this anodization really well. My phone seems to be capturing this in a way that makes this look quite blue. Like, I think when I look down at my screen and this is coming across as kind of teal, but in person, this is actually quite green. And it's described as green. It could be even greener. I've seen anodization that comes even greener, and also I have been holding this. And so the oils on your hands will turn most green spectrums of anodization for titanium in a bluer direction. But yeah, in person, these are all green. And that means that the greens and yellows in this just pair so incredibly nicely with it. And the last thing I wanted to talk about that is that this is the screw holding in the steel lock bar insert over travel stop thing. And that is anodized as well. And it's just crazy to me that little detail was covered. But back to the clip, from a functionality perspective, this is exceptionally well done. I would say the closest thing I could say to a complaint on this clip is that the edge here is just a little bit sharp, but I've never once felt it in hand as sharp. In fact, I don't feel the clip practically at all. This is a very, very comfortable clip in hand. Most of the time, I have to think consciously about whether or not it's there. And so I definitely don't feel this as sharp. If I run my finger over it, this feels sharp. And that's mostly compared to every other surface. Like, this back edge is not sharp at all. And so that's a little bit sharp in comparison. As far as a shape goes, let's see, it's something white in here. Get a good, there we go. Yeah. So this has a really, really nice shape. It has a great amount of ramp, a good amount of clearance. It is one of those milled clips, it's not going to have full deep carry, but what we have sticking out is basically 1/3 of an inch. And because the clip is canted forward at this angle, it means that the knife tends to hang more like this in your pocket rather than this. And so it's not like you have this sticking out of your pocket. It's more common that you'll have this sticking out of your pocket. So it's actually not very bad at all from a depth perspective. And when I have this in my pocket, it's like barely anything that's showing. And what is showing is this ridiculously gorgeous clip. I'm not much of a swirly Damascus, whatever type person. But again, this one in particular really does stand out. Then from a functionality in terms of spring tension, sliding out, I just think it's super, super usable. I really, really liked using this clip. It retains really well, slides in out really well. And like I said, you don't feel it. The last thing I guess I'll say back here is that we have this backspacer. Early versions of this did have a lanyard hole right here, and I'm so glad he dropped that. Or I don't know, I don't see them on the new ones anymore, so maybe he dropped it permanently. Maybe it's something that you have to request to not have. I don't know, but it's been a while since I've seen him with the lanyard hole, and I'm really glad he dropped that. But I guess if you, it is something that he has his files, he can have that made. So if you do get on his books and you want a lanyard, you could put it there. As far as how this handle shape fits, like back here for various grips, I find that in a pinch grip choked back, this end here fits so nice and comfortable in my hand. If I choke up further, this entire just kind of curve fits nice in my hand. And that's actually something I wanted to talk about. I said that all three of these knives at the beginning have this one clean swoop that goes along the top. And that is an aesthetic thing for sure. It's especially noticeable on something like the Neutron and Atom, but it also has another purpose. One of the side effects is that it lowers these 2 points of the knife. And we've talked earlier about having the point lower down makes it easier to get the tip of the knife onto something. But from the back perspective, having this swoop downward in your hand means that it does fit into your hand really nicely in these types of grips because it kind of curls into your hand in a way you would want. But the other thing is that it means that it lowers the back of the knife compared to the pivot. And that gives you good leverage when you're pushing through something hard, because when you're pushing through a material like cardboard, the knife up here, your force is up here and you have a lever arm distance, right? And that means that it wants to kind of push the knife up. But since your main force is where your thumb and your fingers are, becomes the fulcrum, the pivot point at which the knife is trying to rotate. And so when you push up here, you see how that's pushing the knife blade back down there? That means that this is your fulcrum, this is the lever arm distance, and this is the hand lever arm distance. And so the real force that's keeping this up, this is what's pushing it down through material, but the thing that's keeping it in line is your ability to pull up on the knife back here. And so the lower down this comes, and the more you can get a good grip and good leverage on it with the back of your hand, the more you're able to hold this knife straight and resist that upward force coming from the material cutting through. And so, yeah, stylistic for sure, but actually functional as well. The very last thing I want to talk about with regard to the handle before we get into the action and all the really cool stuff that's happening up here is just that this thing is wildly internally milled out. Let's get something to reflect light back up. Yeah, okay. Do you see these pockets in there? Holy crap. It is so incredibly thoroughly milled out. As a result, this knife is only 3 ounces. I think it's 3.07 or something like that. There's just really heavy pocketing on both sides, and that means that also the balance point on this knife is pretty nice. We have it right about here. Now, ideally, it would be right there, but right here is pretty darn good, and it just feels really like nimble in your hand and very well balanced as a result. So that handle perspective, that thing that they're doing with the handle really does help. You know, I almost forgot to mention this milling pattern. This is one of several milling patterns that he offers, and it is my favorite. It's called the golf putter milling pattern, and it is because it resembles, or is actually basically the same as, the milling pattern you'll find on the front of some golf putters. Not all, but some golf putters have this concentric circle milling pattern, and it has something to do with evenly distributing grippiness across, I don't know, I don't play golf. But he also offers concentric circles coming out type pattern. He also offers ones with speed holes, though those are increasingly less common. And he also offers just completely plain and with various levels of, you know, blasting and finishing and whatnot like that. But for me, this golf putter pattern is just so cool. A lot of knives steer into that just like straight lines, and it's funny because both of these are equally repetitive. This is just as repetitive as knives with just completely straight lines, but this captivates my brain in a way that those don't. This is so much more mesmerizing to me than when it's just straight lines. When it's just the straight lines, I kind of zone out and stop noticing it after a while, and this just keeps catching my eye. I love it. And with this Zerk that they did on top, I think it just feels so nice too. It's a very pleasant amount of subtle grip, but it just feels great and looks great. I love, love, love it. Okay, so let's finally talk about the action, because oh my god, this is one of the things that shines the most about this, but it's also how we get into that double detent system, and that is where this knife becomes, I think, literally unique. I don't think anyone else in the world is doing it this way, and it is so clever. It's really, really interesting, so be sure to watch this part. One of the reasons people really hype up this knife is because they say it is the best middle finger flicking action of any knife, and holy crap, it's good. Now, I obviously haven't held every single knife, but I've flicked a lot of knives at this point, and I'm the type of person that if a knife can be middle finger flicked, I'm gonna middle finger flick it. And if this isn't the best out there, it has got to at least be tied. This is basically perfect. This is the kind of knife where even a little bit, just like a subtle push, makes it fly out and snap into place with such a wonderful authority. And it just kind of feels like it's going to be, it just feels like it's going to open. It almost feels assisted. And so let's talk about how they're pulling that off. Part of it is the size, positioning, and placement of this hole. So it's pretty far down, which gives you good leverage, and it's pretty far in, which means that it's easy to apply force that's mostly in an upward direction as opposed to out. And importantly, we're not getting interference with this little nub. Back when the drift had a similarly shaped D-shaped hole right here, one of the criticisms that it got is that the whole geometry of this meant that this peak right here crossed that hole. So if you can imagine there's a D-shaped hole right here, as I pull this out, that comes down and gets right in the way of it. And that meant that it was difficult to use the top part of it to apply force. And since what you want is to be applying force relatively up instead of out, that is where you'd want to push. Over here, we don't have that issue. Because the nub is down here instead of up here, this just moves out of the way entirely. So it's easy to use this top part to push in an upward direction. And that's including for if you're slow rolling out. You're not like hitting it. You do kind of scrape against it, but it's not actually interfering in the path. I don't ever push straight up here though. This is the kind of knife that I typically stick my finger in and pop out. And oh my God. But it's also the kind of knife that you can do it anywhere, because this detent is reasonably strong. So all it really takes is breaking the detent. And there's just such little friction here that it doesn't really encounter enough to stop it, even with relatively firm lock bar. The newer versions of these have a lighter lock bar pressure. He started tuning these to be slightly lighter because it means that there's less friction on the blade, less force pushing on the blade, and makes it a little bit more drop shutty. That's the feedback that he got, is that people wanted to be drop shutty. And so this is the kind of thing where it's just kind of a little bit more of a shaker, but it's so incredibly smooth. In my unboxing video, I said that this wasn't the most glassy thing in the world kind of thing. And that's because I'd just been playing with the Trevor Burger, and those are like, that's like the smoothest thing in the entire universe. Compared to that, nothing is smooth. But compared to normal knives, especially knives with a stonewash finish, this is exceptionally smooth, super duper glassy. And as a result, when you break that detent, there's very little resistive force actually slowing it down. But the next part is that at the end here, on most knives, there is this click. Oof. Part of what makes this so satisfying is that it just slams into place with this really delightful authority, and it's unique and satisfying. It's this singular click. And we're going to talk in a moment about why it's kind of being propelled forward at the end there. But let's talk first about just what's happening with this click. On most knives, you get 2 clicks. Most knives have a detent ball, and when you slide off of the detent ball, let me get a surface to reflect light back up. There's the detent ball, right? There's the detent ball, so track that. When we're up on the detent ball and we slide off of it, there's the first click. The moment that we're off the detent ball, now the entire steel lock bar insert, or on a knife like this, the entire lock bar itself is now riding on the blade tang. So we have more friction, because instead of that singular detent ball surface that's been smoothed out, we now have that entire lock bar that's riding. And then we have to travel off of that until we're finally into our second click. And so in most knives, you get these 2 clicks. The earlier the lockup, the earlier the detent, basically how far do you have to close the knife before you hit that detent ball? The earlier that is, the closer these clicks are going to be together. And so on this one, this is roughly 90 degrees to detent. And so they're closer together. And when you do it all together, yeah, but you still feel that double click. Even when you're like flicking this out fast, it resonates different. On this one, which is twice as far, this is still not bad by industry standards. A lot of knives are 22, 20 plus. This one's 18, but it means that it's further apart, and you get. And even when you open it fast, you feel and you hear that, and there's that period, that 18 degrees that it has to move, where it is dragging that entire way. Over here on the Roosevelt, we have effectively none of that. It closes in one thing, just one click. And it's funny, he says that he does the double detent system for that purpose, to give it just the one click and not get 2. And the funny thing is that in a weird way, this knife technically has 3 clicks. It's hard to hear the first one. It's right there. This is the first click. And then this is the second click. And then finally the third. And the thing is, those clicks are so close together, and the first one is so subtle, that you basically only ever experience them as one atomic thing. It's the only way you're going to get that most pronounced one, this one at the end, before that, is if you put your hand in a way that's going to physically block it from opening. Otherwise, the act of sliding off that detent ball is going to make it pop all the way off. What's going on here is the positioning of this detent, these two different detent balls, how they ride on the blade path, and also finally how the actual lockup is done. A lot of people will mistakenly say that the Roosevelt uses the detent balls themselves as the lock face, like the way that the Chris Reeves knives, Zon or Sebenza 31 is. And part of the main reason for why people say that is because it used to be true. Early on, this knife didn't have a steel lock bar insert, which means it also didn't have an over travel stop. And in those versions of the knife, the detent balls were in fact acting as the lock face engagement. When he added the steel lock bar insert, he changed that. So the detent balls still sit at the very front and sit proud. Let's see if I can get with some light in here. Let's see if I can get you to see it. If I zoom in. Okay, so this right there is the detent ball, and there's the second detent ball. And they are, in fact, sitting up proud of this surface. But do you see that? That is part of the steel lock bar insert. And that is what's actually making the lock engagement on modern versions of this knife. It's this tiny little nub, but it does stick up further than either of the detent balls, and that's the thing that we are resting on when we hear that second click. Like we have our first one, and then our second one, and we are now sitting on that little tiny bar. And look how like barely I have to move to get that off. And so what that means is that the like detent earliness is this. That's 1.5 degrees. It could be 2. It's kind of hard to measure, but like compared to 9, this is 1.5 degrees. So if you move this over to the point where you pull this down at all, you're up on that detent ball. It's practically the same as the Zon and whatnot that have the detent ball as the actual lock engagement. Now, why are we getting 3 clicks? What is that actually happening? Because one of the things that people ask about with this 2 detent system is, doesn't having 2 detent balls mean that you're having twice as much friction because you have 2 different places that is gliding along the knife? And the answer is no, because trickily, only one of those detent balls is ever touching the knife at any given time. One of the detent balls sits slightly prouder of the other, and as a result, you're never actually touching both detent balls at the same time. Let's see if we can see that. I think it's going to help if I zoom in. Okay, lighting wise, does this work? There we are. Okay, so we are up on the further away detent ball. And can you tell that the first one is not touching? It's on that one and not actually touching that one yet. There, you can kind of see the light shining between it. So that one that's forward is sticking up less far. And so this entire path that we're traveling here, we're only ever on the back detent ball. Yep. It's only until we get right here. If you look down in here, how do I get my light to make this work? Is that working? No, I don't know. Anyway, it's only until we're right here that we now slide off of that back detent ball. Sorry, right there. Now we're sliding off of that back detent ball, and now we're resting on the front one. Not touching, touching, not touching, touching. And what's happening is that we're falling off of the back of the blade and onto the second detent ball. And it's an incredibly minor bump down. Do you see how it's kind of popping down right there? That's us falling off the first detent ball and onto the second. This is us falling off the second detent ball, which is a much further drop, and onto that little nub. And this is us falling off of the nub. Okay, so let's finally turn this page over and show what's going on here. I'll also take this knife apart and show you the actual insides, but it's kind of hard to show you what's happening in between these two surfaces because you can't really get into it. So I drew this picture for us. So this picture is not perfectly drawn correctly, but it's close enough. You get the idea. What we have is two different detent balls that have different arcs that they would travel. This one that's closer is sticking further out. And so as a result, as long as the blade is over it, it's going to touch the blade and wear this path in the entire way. The one that's further away is not as sticking as far out. And so while the blade is over that detent ball, it's not actually touching the blade down here, which is why I drew it as a dotted line. It's not until we fall off of this detent ball as part of a rotation that we're now on that detent ball and we are able to clip just this corner. And you can see there is the tiny little nub. So why would you do this? One of the reasons for doing this is to increase the strength of the detent. By the further that you can push your detent ball out, the larger your lever arm distance is. And since torque is a force times lever arm distance, and the force is going to be constant no matter where you place this, because this is the strength of the lock bar pushing in, the larger you can make the lever arm, the stronger you can make the detent. Now, normally, that's the balance you're playing in any kind of knife like this, is to get this detent ball as far out as you can to not have this arc cross over the edge of the blade like it would right here. This one would cross over the edge. So on a normal knife, you couldn't put it out this far. And so most knives are playing this really delicate game where we are, let's see, there's the detent ball, and we are coming as close as we possibly can to the edge. And so if you take this knife apart and look at that path, it comes right up to the edge. This is the same thing going on over here. Like this detent ball, let's see if we can zoom in. This detent ball is getting exceptionally close. It's right there, and it's getting exceptionally close to this edge. And I have one knife where it messes up. This is a Lil Native. I realize I'm zoomed in all the way. And the detent is up here on this part because this is a compression lock, so the spring back up there. But on this knife, the detent ball, do you see it? Let's see, where do we find it? It's right there. See how close it's getting? There is actually a point where it runs off the edge. See, it barely does it. So on this knife, it kind of just feels like roughness. Let's see, it's where? Right there. So on this path that it's traveling, it is getting so close to the edge that it's actually running off slightly. This is something that you want to avoid, because if you go off the edge, the same way that you have to bump up onto the tang when closing a knife, it means that you would fall off and bump down and then have to bump back on when opening the knife. And that would be a terrible experience. You'd be like clunk, clunk, and it wouldn't go smoothly at all. So normally you can't push it out as far as you do. But because they do this really clever thing with having the two detent balls at different heights of each other, they're able to get away with having this one further out and only using it at this very last bit. I said that part of the reason you would do this is to increase the lever arm distance. The other part is just to increase that angle. So on a normal knife, because this has to be further in, the angle has to be steeper, and you can normally only get away with about 9 degrees of close. You don't normally see anything more than 9 degrees because they can't push the detent ball out far enough to make it smaller. And that has to do with the way that these angles change. If you keep the two lines parallel, these lines are representing the distance between where the detent ball is and the pivot. So if these two things are equal, then the further you can spread them out, the steeper this angle becomes if you draw a line between them. The closer they are, it's very, very shallow. And so that'd be like a knife that has to close all the way to there. This would be like a knife that has to close to there. And this would be like a knife that has to close to only there. So the further we push this out, the less we have to change that angle. And by making it all the way out here, we're able to make this 1.5 degrees instead of 9. And no other knife is able to do that because they don't have the ability to push this second one. They don't have a second one. They just have this one. And if they maximize this and move it so this arc right there is right along the edge. That's how you get the 9. Having it further back in is how you get the 22. And having it all the way out, the thing that would have gone off the edge, is how you get 1.5. So now let's talk about the other aspect of what's going on, of why it feels like it opens one single bit. And the thing is when you fall off of a detent ball, you get kind of propelled forward. This is true in general. When you are riding along the top of the detent ball, all of the lock bar force is pressing straight upward. The moment you start coming down this, though, and coming onto this angle until you hit 45 degrees, the amount of force, the component force that is acting in the direction that way is bigger and bigger and bigger. And so as a result, the blade starts getting kind of propelled upward. And that's why it feels like it bounces, like it jumps off of the detent ball. And that's true of any knife like this. Normally, you feel like it kind of pushes off and it gets kind of rocketed forward briefly. But on a normal knife, you get then slapped onto the full lock bar insert or the full lock bar. And so even though you did get this slight boost forward, it's immediately slowed down by a significantly more frictionful surface. Over here, what we have is 3 of these in a row, or 2 in a row. They're acting kind of as like a ramp. And so when you fall off of that first one and onto the second detent ball, the blade is slightly propelled forward. It's not a really big one because it's not falling super far, but it's slightly propelled forward. And then when it falls off this second one, these are tall detent balls. And so it's a pretty steep fall, and it's definitely pushed forward pretty hard. And so it's that kind of propelled forward. And again, normally you would be landing on the full lock bar insert or the full lock bar, and you'd be slowed down. That little bit of propulsion you get at the end would be kind of countered because you'd have to drag for like 20 full degrees on a full surface. But here, what we have is just that tiny, tiny little nub. So it's a very small surface that provides very little friction at all, and it's only on that for 1.5 degrees. And so what you end up with is the force of falling off this, that forward force that propels it forward, of that falling off that detent ball, is enough that unless you're actively stopping the blade, it's going to push past that tiny little bit. You have to really be slowing it down and actively stopping it to feel those. Any normal situation, and it's just one solid cascading, propelled forward, propelled even more forward. Yeah, it's so freaking cool. In a moment, we'll take this apart, show inside, and show where all those add up. The last thing I want to talk about with regard to these double detents is this. Let's see if I can show it to you. I have to hold this side very, very still. Okay, wait, right there. Okay, that. So what's happening is I can pull it out until I hit this like little perceived wall. And at first glance, this might look like Detent Rock or Detent Lash, but it's not. Detent Rock is whenever the detent ball is able to move back and forth, slide around within, and hit the walls of a detent hole that is either too large or placed incorrectly. The entire blade is able to slide ever so slightly and stay in either position. That's not what's going on here. What's happening is here, I think, can't know for sure, but I think it's this. We have 2 different depths that the detent balls stick out, but they're the same size ball. And I believe that in its fully closed position, this one, the one that sticks out further, is fully engaging with the hole, and this one just isn't yet. And so by pulling this out slightly, I think what I'm doing is sliding up this detent ball enough that this corner is finally now hitting that detent ball, because I feel that ever so slight edge. And you might think that would make this feel like a mushy break, but it's the exact opposite. This is one of those knives that has such a crisp, clean break that it feels like it would have like a rounded off detent ball, but it doesn't have a rounded off detent ball. And I think it's this gradual step up that's kind of giving it that effect. Normally, as you're pushing up a detent ball, you're moving up this ramp that's getting progressively easier and easier. And so it's the kind of thing where you would normally have a more force applied at the bottom, but then it gets less and less forces needed to push forward the closer you get to the top. And so normal detent balls kind of have a slightly mushy feel, and a rounded off one or plateau like the Brian Nadeau detent hump Those have a crisp edge, so you go up and then immediately fall. By having this kind of staggered effect, it means that by the time that you finally clear this one, the blade is now pushing forward enough that it kind of pops it up onto this one. And this tiny last little bit has a leap forward feeling rather than being just a gradual rise up this hill. Finally falling off the top of this one means that it goes from being slight force on this ramp to being a significantly more amount of force that just pushes it straight over. And so you just get this kind of like pop that happens. I don't know if what I'm saying makes any sense. I don't know if I'm explaining it well. But the end result is that you do get this weird effect that allows you to kind of slightly pull it. But in practice, that feels like building up force. And when you finally get over this one, it pops off that one in a way that just feels incredible. Okay, let's break this down, take a look inside, because there's some really cool stuff going on, including back here. This is one of the things that I would change immediately about this knife. This is a free spinning pivot. I hate that. I hate free spinning pivots, but it means that you have to use 2 pieces, and these are T15s. So I highly recommend one of these stubby ones if you're ever going to need a brace like this. And the reason is because it allows you to have a short lever arm distance. When you're trying to take something apart like this, what you're trying to do is anchor the knife in against something else. And so on your left hand is just trying to keep it stable. And so if you have a long handle like this, it's harder to keep it going just like this. It's easier to go like that and torque to the side as you're trying to push in. And the more that you kind of tip like that, the more it's likely that you're going to pop out. I don't think that's really much of a concern with this, because if you look at how deep the engagement is on this, this is really, really deep. So the odds of you being able to slide out is really slim, but still, the shorter you have here, the more you can hold this in and not have it wiggle. Lastly, if you're going to take something apart like this that has anodized stuff or is just really expensive, use good bits. Use good bits. Check your bits. Make sure they're nice and crisp. Use good bits. Okay, let's take this apart. I think in his unboxing video, I think he said that's the side that came out. I'm going to try my best to not talk through this so that I can fast forward it. And yeah, these are T15s. These are T8s. He did Loctite this, by the way, and told me that I just need to Loctite it back when I get back. Oh, that's super easy. It feels like it is spinning the other way, so I'm going to say it's probably this. I feel like I'm spinning the pivot rather than turning the thing, so I'm going to try this side. I remember him taking this side out. Okay, so this is already wanting to push apart on me because this lock bar is strong enough. So this is already wanting to pop out. So this is one of those knives that I think is going to just slide out. Yep, comes apart pretty darn easily. So let's look at what's going on in here. Okay, so I'm using these little swatches to clean this off. Lots of good gunk. And right off the bat, one of the things you'll see is on this side, this little bearing washer came out. So one of the things that we're going to talk about is the bearings inside this knife and what Kevin has done to it. And that's another thing that I would personally change about this. Because, so when he first started making these knives, he was using just kind of a stamped steel bearing. Here we are, a stamped steel bearing. So one of those ones where it just rolls up around. These days he's using Delrin bearings, which look like this. That right there. I should just get one of those out. These days he's using Delrins, and so if you open it up, it's going to look like this inside. This is what will come stock. It's not what came stock on the old ones. And so what Kev did is he replaced this with every single type of bearing. Now I've already taken this apart before, and Wait, yeah, never mind. When I disassembled it, I said I felt he Loctited it, but that's irrelevant. I didn't Loctite it when I put it back together. Anyway, I've already tried this, and I personally don't really notice a meaningful difference between the action on any of these bearings compared to what was in there originally, which I don't have. Yeah, I bet you there is a meaningful difference. But what's in there right now is in there for a reason. It's these taco bearings, and taco bearings have a small bearing like this, and also a hardened steel washer. And that hardened steel washer is exceptionally thin. It's a 1/128th of an inch thick. It is exceptionally thin. But the reason Kev put these in there is because otherwise it's just riding on the titanium itself. And that's the thing that I don't love. It's worth noting that if you get one of these that has a carbon fiber scale, he does put a hardened steel washer against the carbon fiber. But on the normal ones, he just has it riding on the titanium. I can't seem to get this washer out. I don't need to get it out, but the other washer is just really being held in with capillary action, that kind of force. There it is. There we go. Let's get some isopropyl. Let's get these cleaned up. So yeah, if I bought one of these, I would also put in these taco bearings because I prefer the idea of my ceramic detent balls, like, because they'll come with Delrins now. I prefer the idea of ceramic detent balls riding on stainless steel. Hardened titanium sits at around 40 HRC. Annealed titanium can be around 30, I think. But these are silicon nitride, the black kind of detent balls, or bearing balls. Those are up in the 80s. The white kind, zirconium dioxide, those sit in like the mid 70s, but these are up in the 80s. And yeah, I don't want something that's 80 HRC riding against something 40 HRC and wearing a track in. I don't think it makes that big of a deal, if I'm being completely honest, because the biggest thing it's going to do is wear a track in. And as long as it's wearing just that one track in, then who really cares? If you're not changing out the bearings all the time, then it doesn't matter if it wears a track in. But yeah, I would rather it not be wearing anything like that into the blade, to the handles, just for the longevity. I like to pinch it like this and twirl it in my hand to clean it off. You can see I got all that gunk off by doing that. That is incredibly nice deep engagement on that screw. And then on this side, I'm doing that to get residual Loctite and gunk off. Okay, so now let's finally look at what's going on in here. For the most part, this is pretty straightforward. On this side, we have this spacer, and you can see that in addition to the screws that come in from either side, there is this post in the middle. And if this were a knife that had the lanyard hole drilled through, that's exactly where it would be. But on this version that doesn't have it, it instead has this additional strength post to add both rigidity and alignment. It's the exact same thickness as this stop pin at the front. And this is a very straightforward stop pin. Where things get more interesting is on the other side. Pop back in. This. So this is how the clip attaches. And ordinarily, if you had a single screw, this would wiggle. And the truth is this does still wiggle just ever so slightly, but functionally not. And the reason is because of these two additional pins. He has these little dowel pins right here and right here that are acting as two additional points of force, and especially in a triangle shape compared to this screw there. And so if you want to take this off, those are pretty tightly in. And so what you want to do, there's no reason for me to do it right now, but you would take this off. This is also T8. By the way, that's not showing at all. And he anodized that too. What the heck? Anyway, you would screw this out, and then when it's sitting up top and kind of proud, you would then push it in with the bit driver and push it off those two posts. And then you just kind of wiggle it back in and pop it into place in the back. So that is a cool, innovative thing that he's doing. Over here is where we can finally see the steel lock bar insert. And this is where all of that magic is happening. Let's zoom in on this. Yeah. So this part down here is obviously the over travel stop that encounters that right there. And this nub right at the tip, that is the lock face. And you can see that it indeed does not come up as high as these, but that these do still sit proud. And I'm not sure how well it's going to come across right here, but maybe if I put something light behind it. Can you tell that one is deeper than the other? Probably not. Anyway, on the other side of that, that's what we really want to look at, is this here, the path in the blade. And just like my drawing earlier, here is the one arc that travels the entire way that the lower down and further sticking out detent ball travels. And then here is the tiny corner that it paths through right there. This other one doesn't counter any over here, and it also doesn't encounter down here. It only encounters at the very edge right there as it's finally knocking off. Now, as a result, because of the specific placement he's done here, which is very carefully done, you can see that it only starts hitting right there. It's not even hitting at the edge. It's only right there. And that's part of the reason why you definitely don't ever have that kind of fall down feel. You never actually bump off of this edge. It's only ever contacting this second detent ball is only ever contacting for this exceptionally short path of travel. Get that to focus right there, from right that tiny edge, which is not all the way to the edge, to over there. The one thing that he could potentially do is add a detent ball ramp, and it would mean two detent ball ramps theoretically, one right there and one right there, and he doesn't. But you can see that there is a slight divot right here, and I think that's just from wear. I don't think that's from any kind of intentional ramp going on, but I could be wrong. Maybe he's trying to put the ever slightest ramp in, but it doesn't feel like there is one. But yeah, there we go. These are, by the way, these are interesting looking. Normally it's a circular hole, and it's because they're drilled down. I get the impression that this is done slightly differently. I don't know how this is done. Maybe it's done as part of the mill. My gut says the reason these are oddly shaped is because getting this to hit perfectly aligned is difficult. That it's difficult to get this placement just perfect on two of these. So my gut says probably that this slightly odd shape is because he has to slightly fine tune the positioning of these, because he can't change the positioning of these once they're set. And so I think he probably has to slightly fine tune the positioning of these edges in order to make these both hit the same point. And you can see the very light tracing that he made to see where to place this hole in the beginning. That is him running that ball over as if it were touching to find the location of that hole. Anyway, so let's put this all back together. These bearings will need to go in first, and they need to face a specific way. Let's see which side has a more deeper track worn in. Honestly, this looks like he might have flipped this around at some point. This looks like it has a slightly more prominent track, so I'm going to put that side facing the balls. On the other one, what do we got? Same kind of deal. They both have a track worn in. This one has the more obvious track worn in, so I'm going to put this side facing the balls. Okay, like the disassembly, I'm going to try not to talk during the assembly because I want to be able to set that fast forward and not worry about making it so you can hear me. So, okay. I'm going to use nano oil. I could use KPL, whatever, but I have nano oil. I tend to use those. And I am going to use light inside everywhere and heavy on the Detent Rock and Loctite blue stick kind to lock this up. So I will interject here to say that I wasn't tightening these down all the way anyway, but I do see that I need to back them out to the point where I can wiggle this more because it did slightly flop off of that. I thought I was still up on the pivot, but it popped out, so I think I need to pop these back out. What I'm going to do this time is just lightly put this into place to hold it there while I get these backspacers in. I'm trying to get this to line up and it's not quite wanting to pop together. I just wasn't paying enough attention. Oh, that's the real thing I'm doing dumb. Oh, all of this entire thing is me being dumb. Wow, all of that. All of that was me trying to assemble it with the lock open, fully engaged. And it was being pushed too far out. It was up too far on the lock bar. And so all I needed to do was take this up, pull this in, and now that lines up just fine. And yeah, this lines up just fine. I'm glad I didn't do anything crazy. I certainly wouldn't do anything crazy in someone else's knife, but yeah, that all went together really easy once I realized that I should have had that up on the bar. So let me make sure that this all kind of goes together. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is tighten these down and then back this back out, put Loctite on it, and that'll be finished and reassembled. And then it is going back to Kevin tomorrow, and it will cure in the mail. So with my thumb on this, can I just spin this out? Yep, pretty darn easily. In general, but especially with blue Loctite in the stick form, I like to use a toothpick to get the Loctite into the center of the pivot, because I don't want it to back up the screw and get onto the outside up here. So now I'm curious, just with my thumb or finger, how much I can tighten this down sufficiently. So like right now, I got to the point where it's just starting to spin at the back, but we're centered. Do I have blade play? No. Nope. None at all. But how is my action? Really good. Well, okay, I might be done. I'm going to check it just a little bit more, but right now, centering looks perfect to me. Absolutely zero blade play. And my action is, yeah, as smooth as when I got it. Do I want, no, I don't think I want to tweak this at all. This is perfect. And this, woo, love it, love it, love it. Okay, so all of that fuss had to do with me just being dumb about how I was assembling it. The lesson learned was to put this up onto the blade tang so that it wasn't accidentally pushing the blade too far out that way. I will double check that these are tightened down. Yeah, they are. Yeah, they're good. And this is right where I want it. So yeah, I'll call it that a day. Okay, so let's wrap up where are my overall feelings of this knife, and this is where I'm finally going to talk about price. The short version is I freaking love this knife. I went in thinking that this would probably be a very me knife, that it would be unique enough in specific ways, that it would be interesting to me, and that it would feel good enough to use, that it would be fun for me, and that it would be thin and slicey enough that it would be functional for me. And in all of those regards, it really is. This is very much a person who likes thin, slim, light, slicey knife, and very much a knife nerd's knife. I love this knife. If it had a full-on worn cliffy type blade the way I typically like, this might be the most me knife that's ever been made. It doesn't right now, and so as a result, this is just a knife that I absolutely love and not like the most perfect knife ever. At the end of the day, though, I really, 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 really want one, and that's where price comes in. These start at $500. The base price with nothing else is $500. Milling patterns make it go up some. Fancy materials, zircuti, Damascus, just pure zirconium, those make it go up. He's done some fancy versions. He's done versions that he lotteried off, or raffled off, I guess, that have Damascus blade steels and stuff. But the regular price ranges, these are in somewhere around the $500 to $800 range, depending on what your config is. And since the config that I would personally want is probably something much closer like what Jake Bearded Gear got, something that has pretty much plain Jane, but with the milling pattern. I don't personally want all of the swirls. That means that I would want something that was on the $500, more $550 range. And at that price, yeah, absolutely. This is worth it. It takes a certain kind of crazy to think that any knife is worth $500, but compared to the other things in this general market, what it's competing with, things that are like the Holts and the Craig Browns and the folks that are the Brad Southards, the folks that are making small batch, really, really precision made, high finishing, CNC made machine knives. Yeah, this is absolutely worth it. Absolutely. The problem is you just can't buy it at that price. Some people get to. There are lotteries that are happening consistently. He also holds lottos to get in book spots. Right now he's doing small batches that he's doing lottos for. And yeah, so some people get to pay table. And if you get to pay table for this, yes. If you're the type of person that can spend $500 to $800, and I guarantee you will love this knife. But for everyone else, these are currently going at like 2 to 2.5 times markup on secondary. So that plain Jane $500 one is going to sell for like $1,100, $1,200. And that, ooh, does that sting. And yeah, I agree. This is Lefty EDC's knife. I agree with Kevin that it's the kind of thing where if you have $1,100, $1,200 to spend on a knife, and if you're the type of person that can do that, yeah, if this speaks to you, this just go for it. Like, this will bring you that kind of joy. Because at that price point, like, do I think this is a $1,200 knife? I don't think any knife should really be a $1,200 knife in some regards. When you get to that price point, it's not about whether or not a knife is like good enough. It's about whether or not a knife speaks to you. Because yeah, there's ways that it can earn it even more. Like the precision and beautifulness of the milling can be even better. Or like maybe it's completely handmade and that craftsmanship is just really speaking to you. But often it's just like the design, the way it fits, the way it moves. And if this speaks to you. And so if this knife speaks to you, $1,200, sure, find a way to do it. What sucks though is just that I know that price has to come down, because even though these are customized knives, these are still like that small batch boutique CNC made knives. These are still production knives. And so there's a CNC pattern that can stamp these out. Stamp's the wrong word, but it can make this exact knife over and over and over. It takes a long time, it's a lot harder, it's a lot slower, but you can still make more of these. And he's constantly making more of this exact same knife, maybe slightly customized differently. But that means that supply and demand, at some point, supply has to meet demand. Or earlier than that, supply has to meet demand enough to bring that price down. And it's already happened. These used to go over $2,000. And now, they're 12 to 1500, depending on what your config is. And you can get them, you can find one for $1,000 as a plain Jane if you get lucky. And so that price is already coming down. And the thing is like, just kind of psychologically, that sucks. It sucks to spend money and then know that it isn't worth as much, that it's depreciating in that way. And so it's the kind of thing that if you can get over that, if you can say, this brings me $1,200 worth of joy, and you spend $1,200 on it, great, make that happen. And if you can let go at that point and not care that in 6 months you sell it for $1,000 instead, or even less, I don't know, then great. I have a hard time with that kind of stuff. I don't know if I can let go of that much. And so I know I want one of these. I know I'm going to try and get one, but I don't yet know what that's going to look like. I don't know if I'm going to just incessantly join lottos. I don't know if I'm going to try and get on a book spot at some point. I mean, I am doing both of those things for sure. It might mean that I end up forking out $1,100. If I find a config that's perfectly me and it costs $1,200, I might actually do that. I adore this knife. If this was a sheep's foot blade that would make this like the most me knife, I would do that. I would spend $1,200 on this knife. I might end up trading things for it because I have things that I have invested money in that I just don't bring me as much joy of this, and it's possible through a trade that I might be able to trade something that something I only put $1,000 into, but that has a worth to someone of about $1,200 when you add it up. I don't know, but at the end of the day, I am definitely going to try to get one of these eventually. And if he ever does come out with a sheep's foot version of this, I need that knife. I mean, I need this version, but I would definitely need that one. So yeah, my end feelings about this is yes, it lives up to the hype. But in every regard, in the sliciness, in the action, the way in the holds, the way it feels, the way it does things differently than anyone else, this lives up to the hype. And so, yeah, I freaking love it. And I really hope I can get one at some point. So if I do, you'll definitely see it on the channel. Until then, thank you for watching. Thank you, Kevin, for letting me borrow this. And yeah, I'll catch you next time.